Hey guys, you looking for a new podcast to listen to? Ghost Town is a twice weekly podcast covering and exploring some of the most mysterious and interesting places on Earth, like haunted hotels, abandoned malls, deserted amusement parks, locations of infamous true crimes, weird history, and more. You can find Ghost Town wherever you listen to podcasts, or go to ghosttownpod.com. You shall enjoy. Welcome to Human Monsters. Nanny Hazel Doss was born out of wedlock on November 4th, 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, which has since been incorporated into the town of Anniston. Her mother was Louisa Lou Holder. Lou was kicked out of her family's home and was financially destitute as she struggled to pull her life together so that she and her daughter would have better prospects. Her situation improved when she met James Hazel. He was a farmer, and like most, he was not very well off, but he was willing to take in a woman with a child conceived accidentally out of wedlock. Neither one of them was well placed to expect anything more, so they got together and eventually married. It was not a happy marriage. Not only was James not a warm and affectionate man, but he had a dour and irritable disposition. Whenever he was stressed, his cruel streak would emerge, and it was always best to give him a wide berth under those circumstances. Indeed, there was no honeymoon period. As soon as Lou moved into the house, James bossed her around. If she didn't submit to him, he would put her down or whack her with a cane he used to drive livestock. Typically exhausting, farm life required a great deal of adjustment on Lou's part, as she did an endless amount of farm chores from dawn to dusk, on top of all the domestic duties that were expected of her. There was so much to do that she and James were often out well after dark, completing chores they hadn't managed to do during the day. During this time, little Nanny didn't get much in the way of attention and emotional support. If she cried, she was perceived as an obstacle to the completion of farm chores. Soon after she took her first steps, she was made to contribute around the farm. She would be severely punished if she didn't complete her chores in the allotted amount of time she was given. Nanny had 4 half-siblings, a brother and 3 sisters. Nanny and her mother always hated James. Instead of sending his children to school, he forced them to work on the family's farm. Nanny never excelled when she did pursue an education due to all the instruction she missed, thanks to her father. She and her siblings were only allowed to attend school during the winter, when there was less work to do on the farm. Bullying also tainted Nanny's experience at school. Due to her family's isolation at the farm, she and her siblings' social skills were underdeveloped. They were generally withdrawn and had peculiar mannerisms. They were so used to living only among family that the schoolyard was as exotic as an island nation half a world away. Nanny resented that much of the care for her brothers and sisters fell on her. She cooked their meals, changed their diapers, and arbitrated their disputes. All this while she herself was a child. Between parenting and farm labor, Nanny's childhood was denied to her. A pivotal moment in Nanny's childhood occurred when she and her family took a train to visit family in southern Alabama. Nanny bumped her head on a metallic bar on the seat in front of her when the train jerked to a sudden stop. She hit her head so hard it inflicted permanent and irreversible neurological damage due to a concussion. In the coming years, she endured severe headaches, blackouts, and bouts of depression. She was mentally unstable for most of her life, and she blamed this incident for the state of her mental health and cognitive abilities. An omen of things to come, she began to fall prey to senseless and uncontrollable rages. Regardless of the severity of Nanny's symptoms, James would never allow her to be taken to a doctor for treatment. He didn't have the money for medical bills, and he didn't want to sacrifice the manpower in the event of losing her contribution to the farm chores. He was hard on his other children, but there was at least some tacit affection behind his actions. He had no love or compassion for Nanny. She was pretty much just a slave to James. He would push her to the limits of her endurance as she wept from the splitting headaches and other complications of her concussion. As a girl, her favorite pastime was to read her mother's romance magazines. She would daydream about having her own romantic relationship one day. Reading afforded her the only escape from her wretched life of indentured servitude on the farm. Otherwise, the ratio of work to play on the farm was 100-0. Her father did not allow his daughters to wear makeup and fetching outfits to prevent them from being molested by men. They were also forbidden from attending dances and other social events that were sure to bring them into contact with boys. Even the presence of chaperones on these occasions was not enough to convince James to loosen his grip on the girls. James's desire for an establishment of complete control over Lou and the children made him the locus of their existence. Having practically deified himself, it occurred to Nanny that if he was the source of their existence, he was surely to blame for the conditions of her quality of life. If she was miserable, the accountability would therefore deservedly fall at his feet. Nanny became chronically enraged. If any of her siblings provoked her, she would lash out at them, inflicting a harsh beating. They were keen to avoid a repeat occurrence in the future, and this ensured that they at least treated her with respect. Sometimes James beat her for this, but she didn't care. She was in so much pain from her brain injury that nothing he could do to her compared. She didn't fear him like she did when she was much younger. At this point, he came across like a petty office bully. He still wielded a great deal of power in his domain, but on the emotional front, he held no sway. She once loved him, but when she realized he didn't care whether she lived or died, her feelings for him were derailed, and she headed down another track. When she wasn't angry or depressed, she was lost in a daydream. She pined for a great romance. A man who would take her away from the farm and treat her like a lady. James didn't convince her that the Prince Charming she fantasized about didn't exist in reality. She had faith that he would come galloping into her life on his steed and take her away to a better life. It would only have been made possible if James had allowed her to go out and meet boys at social functions. Lou objected to this practice of keeping the girls on such a short leash, but he would argue that her dating history led to an illegitimate child, so she saw herself as being at a disadvantage in that debate. James decided he would do everything in his power to ensure that Lou's daughters would succeed in retaining their purity where their mother had failed. If she continued to object, he would castigate or beat her until she withdrew her contentions. Nanny was helpless to do anything else but wait for a better future. Until the advent of adulthood, James painted her into a corner. James may have ensured that Nanny and his daughters were not sexually active with their male contemporaries, but this did not prevent the more lecherous of his own relatives from messing with them. Nanny and her sisters were polite, withdrawn, and pliable due to James's autocratic parenting style. Because of this, his daughters were easily preyed upon by uncles and cousins. James would beat these men to an inch of their lives. He did it to send a message. The missive was well received and understood. James's girls were off limits to wandering hands. The one exception was Nanny. When he caught one of his cousins molesting her when she was 12 years old, he blamed her. She was punished and he banned her from attending the social event for which his family congregated. This wasn't the only such incident. One day he caught an uncle unbuttoning her dress, and James sent her to her room for being too flirtatious. Now all the perverts knew that if they wanted to molest a child free of repercussions, they should redirect their attentions to Nanny Hazel. James always blamed Nanny for the sexual abuse she endured. He would say that apple didn't fall far from the tree. This only made Nanny hate him even more, and the fire of her anger raged into a full-blown inferno. That he not only shamed her for the unwanted sexual advances, but that it also happened because he refused to protect her. At this point, she could identify no redeeming characteristics in the man. Nanny's passion for reading remained, but the content of the literature changed considerably. Instead of reading about romantic fantasy, she shifted gears with a determination to kickstart her very own real-life love story. Every time James threw out the day's paper after reading it, Nanny would retrieve it and read the Lonely Hearts and Missed Connections columns to see if any of the men appealed to her. She decided that if James did not allow her to commute to where the man was situated, they would have to come to get her. At that point in her life, a rescue was in order. She sent a few letters over a period of several months, but she could never receive a response without James intercepting it. He didn't beat her for this, but needless to say, she didn't meet her husband. Nanny was restless. She was 15 years old and knew that her future prospects as a scholar were already dashed due to her checkered attendance record. She didn't just want to leave school, she wanted to move on with her life in toto. James, of course, wasn't prepared to let her go. Not only was she useful to him as a farm slave, but she had also taken on many of the domestic duties that used to only fall on her mother's shoulders. She knew there was no way to persuade him to emancipate her by appealing to him emotionally. Instead, she constructed a logical argument. She was aware that the farm wasn't making enough money, so she informed him that by letting her move out into a township or urban center, she could get a job and send money home. James wasn't in a rush to agree to this, but after meditating on it, he realized there was no logical argument against her doing so. She began her job search the next morning, feeling liberated for the first time in her life. Nanny was hired by the linen thread mill in Blue Mountain. She became friends with everybody in the factory and eventually established social connections in the community at large. Eventually, she became more synonymous with the Hazel name than either of her parents. She was delighted to be so socially active, and she loved her new life. She was still too young for the adult bachelors of the town, but that didn't mean they didn't notice how attractive she was. For many, a silent countdown to her 18th birthday was underway. Nanny was considered to be a risk as a marriage prospect. She had a better reputation than her mother when she married James, but her family could not afford a dowry. Even if James had sold the entire farm, he wouldn't have brought much to the table, not that he would ever have even considered doing such a thing. Only a rich man could afford to marry Nanny Hazel. In rural communities, very little wealth could be found. Matrimony was not a closed shop to Nanny. A rich older man may not have been willing to risk his fortune on her, but there were plenty of young men working at the factory. They liked what they saw, and their parents could not dissuade them from their pursuit of Nanny Hazel. Nanny did all she could to install herself in as close proximity as possible to the young male workforce of Linen Thread Mill. One technique was to take up smoking. She socialized with men as they smoked outside, though it was usually inside of the factory where they approached her for dates. The noise produced by the machines afforded them the kind of discretion that such a sensitive exchange required. Nobody wants you to hear them getting rejected. Nanny made it abundantly clear to all who expressed interest that she was only interested in marriage. This scared most of them off, but one boy, Charlie Bragg, was so sweet on her, it took everything in him to refrain from proposing at first sight. He was 17 years old, tall, handsome, and charming. Even James liked him. Nanny had become rebellious, and if she were married, it would mean one less headache for James to deal with. Charlie was a better husband to Nanny than James had been to Lou, but it was hardly the romantic whirlwind of her dreams. They didn't spend a lot of quality time together. Most of the special occasions they spent together were at family meals and holiday functions. Nanny wrote in her diary in 1921 that she felt she was forced to marry Charlie. He was the only suitor who wished to marry her, and she was anxious to flee from James Hazel's gulag. It was her singular option, and as she could see after they got settled, a highly regrettable one. The approval of both their families was sought and taken into account, which made the marriage feel somewhat transactional. Even as she walked the aisle, she was shackled to James Hazel. At the wedding, there weren't many attendees on Charlie's side. His mother and 3 male friends from work, that was all. He didn't have many friends, and it didn't help that many of the guys at work resented him because he landed Nanny. Most of Nanny's guests were relatives. She didn't make a lot of close friends among the women at the factory. Some of her older female friends at the factory attended the wedding partially to say goodbye to her, since she was resigning from her position. Nanny intended to be the perfect wife for Charlie. She would do the housework, care for their children, and cook up to his expectations. She was confident that she could establish the marriage she wanted, since Charlie was, to a large degree, compliant. Nanny was looking forward to exploring her sexuality in her marital bed. Up until then, her sexual experience was limited to the sexual impropriety that was foisted upon her by the perverts in James's family. She was disappointed by her first experience of intercourse, more rupture than rapture. Another letdown was the presence of her mother-in-law. She was usually abrasive to Nanny. To make matters worse, Charlie invited his mother to live with them. While her mother-in-law didn't beat Nanny, she nagged and criticized her at every turn. Nothing Nanny did for Charlie was good enough for the old bag. She would even hector Nanny to repeat tasks until they were performed to her stringent specifications. There was never enough time and energy for Nanny to perform at this standard, and she was exhausted at the end of the day. What's more, there was never enough time to complete all the tasks because her mother-in-law was so exacting. Unlike at the farm, where she could commiserate with Lou about what an abusive taskmaster James was, Nanny didn't dare say anything bad about Charlie's mother while he was around. It would have crushed him. He was in the dark about the ways in which his mother behaved when he wasn't around. When she was there, she was nothing but polite and warm toward Nanny. Mother Bragg spent years honing Charlie's personality so that he would put his mother's needs above all others. Her mother-in-law had been plotting against her before she was even made aware of her existence. She lost the game before she drew her first turn. This situation made it impossible for Nanny and Charlie to have a date night so they could enjoy some very rare one-on-one time. Whenever they had an outing planned, his mother would fake an illness so that they were forced to stay home and give her even more attention. Charlie was a full-blown mama's boy. He was apparently living in bliss, but for Nanny, it was an Oedipal nightmare. As she did during her days on the farm, Nanny escaped through the stories she read in romance magazines. Mother Bragg even infringed on this one little diversion from the wretched, day-to-day drudgery of doing her daily domestic work twice as hard for the approval of someone who contributed nothing of value whatsoever to her life. Mother Bragg considered the reading of such content to be adulterous. She would destroy and discard the magazines if she managed to get a hold of them. These legal publications were smuggled into the house, where they became illicit contraband under the watchful eye of that old bitch. One day his mother said to Charlie that she was relieved that Nanny wasn't reading such material. Now that he believed she boycotted the aforementioned publications, there was no way she could bring them home. There wasn't enough room in the marriage after his mother moved in. There was a hierarchy in the household, and Nanny was at the bottom. Queen Mother Bragg was on top, and Prince Charlie awaited his hereditary upgrade following her demise. Nanny, she was the help. She was perceived by both of them as useful only as a domestic servant. It became harder and harder for Nanny to find an escape route, even the temporary kind. Even having her own mother over as a guest was an ordeal. Mother Bragg always gave her the cold shoulder. The only diversion she had left was substance abuse. She became a problem drinker and smoked like a fiend. This became problematic because no one with a brain injury like her own should ever imbibe alcohol. She became chronically depressed. She coped with the Mother Bragg situation by ignoring her comments. As she was so dissatisfied with how the housework was being done, she was welcome to do it herself. But of course, that never happened. One advantage Nanny had was that she kept her husband sexually satisfied. Whether she was in the mood or not, she accommodated his appeals for intimacy. He wasn't about to give that up. Eventually they had children, and now it was even more unlikely that he would leave her. He needed Nanny to take care of his children. His mother was useless. How would she have been able to keep house and tend to the children's needs? She was a worn-out, wrinkled old hag. One 3 a.m. diaper change, and she would have been down for the count. She and Charlie had 4 daughters, one a year from 1923 to 1927. In between pregnancies, Nanny grew to react to Charlie's touch with revulsion. She already hated him for being the spineless little worm who catered to his officious mother's every whim and took her side against Nanny. She only had sex with him when she was an estrus. It was purely transactional. He could blast her with jizz when she was ready to have another baby. Otherwise, he was just a goddamn man-baby, and she was disgusted with that aspect of him. It was cringe-inducing just to hear his voice at that point, especially when he pampered his mother. Somewhere in the afterlife, Sigmund Freud was taking notes. With the children in the picture, Mother Bragg's needs were deprioritized, especially as Nanny was concerned. Nanny hated her mother-in-law more than ever now. If Mother Bragg thought she was going to be put before the children, she had another thing coming. Maybe Charlie was enough of a pussy to accept those conditions, but there was no way Nanny would see that as existing anywhere near the realm of acceptability. The children were the levies that kept Mother Bragg at bay. Occasionally, Nanny would persuade Lou or Mother Bragg to watch the children as she went out. Whatever the nature of her cover story, Nanny went to the gin mills of Anniston. Her objective? To meet a man, a strong man whose umbilical cord was severed not just at birth, but also from every fiber of his emotional and spiritual being. A mother should be in the background of her adult son's life, and Nanny had learned this lesson the hard way. The town's rumor mill caught wind of Nanny's activities at the gin mills. Lou heard talk about Nanny being an outright floozy. She was informed that she walked about topless in the bars. She allowed drunkards to fondle her openly. She would go into back rooms with them to have sex. Whether these tales were hyperbolic or not, it was true that Nanny was treating her wounds with liquor and sex. Nanny was still depressed, but she never felt remorseful about her infidelity. Charlie had had affairs with women he knew at the factory throughout the years. They were the lucky ones, of course. If Nanny had told them about the situation with Mother Bragg, they wouldn't have felt as neglected when he departed for home. Nanny's life became more stressful than ever. She was catering to the demands of 6 people now. It ate up so much of her time that it became harder and harder for her to smoke, drink, and hook up with men. Charlie was still cheating, and remarkably, he scored by complaining about what a terrible wife and mother Nanny was. He was pathetic and found a way to capitalize on it. It got to the point where Charlie and Nanny barely interacted anymore. Nanny fretted about the future, a time when what was the current situation was sure to grind her down to nothing. Charlie and his mother were shitting on her dreams. She was desperate to find a way out. Though Nanny loved her children profoundly, caring for them, especially 4 of them at once, was a real hardship. There were too many of them for her. Mother Bragg wouldn't have dreamed of helping beyond the occasional bout of babysitting, which didn't require much effort. Back then, men didn't involve themselves with child care. Nanny's strongest connection was with her daughter Malvina. Motherhood was so much better when it was just the one child. It became a burden when the next 3 came along. She decided she only had the strength and spirit to raise one child right and give her the best life possible. By this point, Charlie disappeared from the house for up to 3 days at a time. It was a bender of boozing and womanizing, and it was shameless. Everybody knew about it by then. He and his wife couldn't have possibly been more out of touch with each other. One day when he returned to the nest after a 3-day bender, an enormous crowd was assembled in his house. He had to push through them to get in. He was hungover and baffled, as he had not been notified about what had brought those people around. He was given hugs and condolences. Had someone died? Many of them were dressed in black, so that was a possibility. He began to panic. It occurred to him that his mother must have died. Soon after, he found her in the kitchen talking with other women her age. Nanny was in there as well. Lou and James were also in attendance. It must have been an especially egregious event that brought them together if James Hazel turned up to show his support. The baby and Malvina stayed by Nanny's side. The other 2 girls were nowhere to be found. Charlie noticed this and said, "Where are the girls?" This put a hush over the crowd. It became clear to everybody else that Charlie knew nothing about the tragic event that brought them together. They were also annoyed at him for not having arrived sooner. Knowing the reason he was out of the loop likely added to their ire. James took it upon himself to grab Charlie by the arm and lead him to a location where he could receive the unfortunate news with some discretion. He was informed that his middle 2 daughters had died. The attending physician recognized symptoms of food poisoning, but a diagnosis eluded him. Charlie hadn't even been there to say goodbye. For this mistake, even his mother berated him. Nanny didn't care that he wasn't around. She had no love for him by then, and relished his absences. She also enjoyed being the recipient of empathy and condolences from the townsfolk. Normally, nobody cared when she suffered. Some people only piled it on until they broke her. She was delighted to discover that people spoke at length to both Charlie and his mother about what a wonderful wife and mother Nanny was. It was determined that the girls ate some tainted grains in their morning porridge. No persons were considered to be criminally responsible. Nanny was a fastidious housekeeper, so it couldn't have been due to neglect or careless workmanship. Thereafter, Charlie was a target of contempt among all those who knew him. It must have sunk in, for even he began to seriously consider that he failed his family and was the cause of all their undoing and misery. The next time Nanny served him dinner, there was a void beyond her eyes. There was neither love nor disdain behind her actions. She felt nothing, and it was obvious to him. It was chilling. In the middle of the night, Charlie packed his bags, grabbed Malvina, and fled. He was convinced that Nanny killed the 2 girls. He also felt that after the townies fed her ego about what a wonderful human being she was, Her next victim would be him. Nanny was attending to Florine's needs as he left the house. When everybody in town found out about what Charlie had done, they despised him more than ever. This was worse than anything he had done to her. Malvina was her favorite. Her relationship with her firstborn was the best of her entire life. It felt like he absconded with her soul. 1927 was one of the worst years of Nanny's life. She received offers to return to James's farm, but she wasn't about to make matters worse by living under his thumb again. The Braggs' family had some savings, but they soon dwindled to nothing. Nanny was left with no other recourse but to return to work. She was hired by a cotton mill. She was not only a single mother, but supporting and caring for her wretched mother-in-law. It was a dress rehearsal for an eternity in hell. The only relief came when Mother Braggs finally kicked the bucket in summer of that year. Good riddance. It was difficult for her to maintain the upkeep of the house on her meager income. She would socialize from time to time, but the only person she missed was Malvina. In summer of 1928, Charlie returned. It was unannounced. Just as surprising was the female stranger and the little boy that accompanied him and Malvina. His primary motivation for getting together with this woman was his dearth of child-rearing and domestic skills. He had heard about his mother's death, and he was determined to turf Nanny out of the house he felt was rightfully his. A transaction was in order. Charlie gave her Malvina. She gave him the house. As she left, Charlie caught a look and that chill in her eyes. He could tell that if she were so inclined, she could kill him easily, and with nary a nanosecond of remorse. Nanny returned to James's farm. There was no alternative, and it was only under the most dire of straits that she would do so. Lou was happy to have her grandchildren in the house, but James was only happy to have an extra hand to contribute, and that was a non-negotiable term. The farm was struggling financially, so it needed as much help as it could get. She eventually divorced Charlie, citing infidelity as a motivating factor. Nanny sought work outside of the house. She couldn't return to the thread mill because Charlie resumed his old position there. She was eventually hired by a cotton mill in Anniston. The lengthy commute was tiresome, the work was grueling, and the atmosphere was very hot due to the heat emanating from the machines. But it paid better than her position at Blue Mountain, and, as she saw it, the more time spent away from the farm, the better. Despite having 4 children and enduring many hardships, Nanny retained her natural beauty, and it did not go unnoticed by her male co-workers. Nanny was ecstatic to be the recipient of such attention, especially after all the years of being married to a man whose true betrothal was to his mother. She was not about to jump into bed with every man who threw that option on the table, nor would she have married without taking a closer look into the psyche of her suitor. She was also determined that her parents' opinions held no sway. Above all, what she wanted was true love. She had had a lonely childhood, and eventually even her marriage left her isolated. She wanted someone who would make her his world. She began reading the Lonely Hearts columns, seeking someone whose relationship goals were commensurate. She sent in a photograph and even mailed out pies to those who responded, as she was a talented baker. If the pies weren't enticing enough, she would send racy letters to appeal to their loins. She had to go to the extra mile since she was a single mother who had gotten on in years. Any of the replies were addressed to her in the form of romantic poetry. Such was the stuff of her fantasies. She was living out her dreams. In 1929, she received a letter containing a poem and a photo of a man named Robert Franklin Harrelson. He was a 22-year-old factory worker from Jacksonville, a township located in the same county. Though he was 2 years older than she, he was mature for his age. He lived alone in an apartment in the city, was socially active and loved jazz. Nanny sent him a slice of spice cake, a photograph, and a tantalizing letter. Frank drove to the farm to meet her, and they were immediately smitten with each other. He proposed 2 months later, and she accepted without hesitation. The way she saw it, he was a dream come true, and she didn't want to blow her opportunity to link up with such a wonderful man. Nanny, Frank, and the 2 girls moved to Cedartown, Georgia, where Frank was hired to work at the Goodyear textile mill. Their marriage was satisfying overall, even if he drank a little too much for her liking. The drinking eventually became a serious problem. Once Prohibition ended, he was able to buy liquor legally and drink in bars, and that's what he did with friends every evening after work. It got to the point where he spent more time drinking with his friends than with Nanny. Dinner would go cold, and her depression returned. Most aspects of her life were good. They were well provided for. Her girls were growing up to be exceptional young women. They lived in a beautiful home. Still, taking Frank's behavior into account, she wondered if it was only a matter of time before everything turned to shit. Frank had a temper, and he was a violent drunk. Occasionally, he was taken to the drunk tank after a brawl. He wasn't aware that Nanny, too, had a long and burning anger within her. One night, as she drove him home from jail, the rage was building within her. She wasn't just angry because he ran afoul of the law. She was angry that he lied to her. He kept his problem drinking a secret. After selling himself as the perfect man of her dreams, he turned out to have one foot in the gutter. Nanny tried to break Frank's habit. One tactic was to accompany him when he went out to a bar. This only resulted in them becoming equally hammered. Once when they did this, they made arrangements for Melvina to be cared for, but not Florine. She once arrived home from school to find the place deserted. She was alone for 2 days before the police picked her up and searched the area for Nanny and Frank. They eventually took her to Charlie's place in Alabama. Nanny snatched her back a few days later. Following this incident, Nanny cut down in her drinking. Frank did not. She decided to let sleeping dogs pass out and savor the occasional romantic moments as they came. Meanwhile, Frank's reputation was undercut by his drinking. It affected both his personal and professional life. Having become disillusioned by Frank's behavior, Nanny turned to a familiar diversion: romance magazines and the Lonely Hearts columns. By now, Frank became verbally abusive. Eventually, during his drunken tantrums, he started beating her. He did the same to her children. Still, she stayed with him for 16 years. Frank became such a monster around the house that Melvina and Florine resolved to marry their way out of the house like Nanny did as a young woman. Melvina married, and Nanny's grandson, Robert Lee Haynes, was born. This brought Nanny happiness, and it had been a long time since she felt that way. She hadn't been close to Melvina emotionally for a long time, and her offers of assistance with the baby brought them closer together. Eventually, Florine moved in with Melvina and provided care in her own right. When Melvina became pregnant a second time, the occasion wasn't nearly as joyous as it had been for Nanny the first time. She envisioned a repeat of history suffered by Melvina when facing the stressors of caring for 2 or more children. When the baby was born, Melvina was so exhausted by the delivery she passed out. Nanny held the baby as she slept. By the time the doctor returned to Melvina's room, the baby had died. When one of the hospital's staff noticed the child wasn't breathing, Nanny handed the baby over. The baby was examined to ascertain the cause of death. None could be detected. Melvina was devastated and found it difficult to accept that her baby could be dead just like that. The next day, Melvina returned home and confided in Florine about something troubling she had witnessed, apparently in a dream. She told her she had a nightmare wherein she saw Nanny pull a pin from her hat and push it into the soft spot on the baby's head. From this vision, she was sure she witnessed her mother in the act of committing infanticide. Florine recalled that Malvina's husband had been kicked out of the room by Nanny. It was normal back then for fathers to be purged from the premises when their children were born, so he likely didn't protest. When Florine returned to the room after the baby was declared deceased, she saw Nanny playing with a hat pin. Neither Malvina nor Florine could entertain the possibility that their mother murdered her grandchild. It was ludicrous. She had been practically raising little Robert. Why would she do any harm to another grandchild? They filed away their suspicions, but that didn't mean they perished along with the baby. Malvina was so devastated she was mired in a devastating depression. Her relationship with her husband broke down, and she began to neglect Robert. Nanny picked up the slack. Malvina sought solace in the arms of a paramour. She would drop Robert off at Nanny's house and depart for a weekend of debauchery. Nanny disapproved, since she had taken the same actions and it hadn't done her any good. One day after returning from a weekend away, reeking of alcohol, tobacco, and bargain basement aftershave, Nanny confronted her. She suggested that if she wasn't happy with her current husband, there were still many men out there who would have gladly have scooped her up. Malvina was indignant, and she continued with her affair. Nanny's anger began to fester again. Now it was reaching a boiling point. She began to resent Malvina. Malvina thought she was suffering the tortures of the damned, but in comparison to the life Nanny had lived, it was paradise. Malvina had always been a very willful girl, and she was rebelling because she hadn't been getting her way. Nana was enraged that the perfect life she sought was always out of reach, and it was always due to another person's doing. She had given of herself, and it was never good enough. Little Robert was the only person who had never hurt her in any way, but since he was very little and vulnerable, she could hurt him, and hurt him she did. Rats were a constant problem for the denizens of the rural community where James's farm was located. Nanny still kept a box of arsenic around to be used in the event of an infestation. She added some to the cookie dough she was preparing. Robert ate all the cookies she made for him. By the time he retired to bed early, he was achy and lethargic. Nanny did this to punish his mother. Nanny slept soundly that evening, with a smile on her face. She finally found an outlet for anger. To be more precise, she had been engorged with homicidal rage for years, and now the appetite was satisfied with exactly what it had been starving for. In the morning, Nanny went to check on Robert. He was cold and unresponsive. Nanny called the doctor. He pronounced Robert dead. He stated that the cause of death was asphyxia, implying that the boy died of natural causes, or what is known today as SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. Today, a thorough autopsy would not be performed without a chemical analysis. It would be no trouble at all for today's forensic pathologists to detect the presence of arsenic in the boy's blood, but the procedure was not as advanced at the time of Robert's death. There were no signs of foul play, and Nanny was still highly regarded throughout the community because of the doting wife and mother she had been and all she suffered through. They never would have imagined that she would have a motive for murdering a little boy. When Malvina returned from her bender, her suspicions about her mother returned. This was the second child that died in her care. There were so many people consoling Nanny that it was nearly impossible for Malvina to elbow her way in. For the time being, it would be difficult for her to confront Nanny. It's also difficult to accuse someone of murder if you don't have evidence. At the funeral, Nanny's display of mourning was more melodramatic than that of Malvina. At one point, she fainted and landed in the dirt. Malvina wasn't the only one who suspected Nanny of having blood on her hands. After Nanny was out of earshot, Frank said, I reckon that I'm next." Her daughters shared their suspicions, but as before, they couldn't prove it. All Melvina had was that dream, and the police don't consider nocturnal revelations to be admissible as evidence. Frank was drinking and fighting as always. For a time, his fighting became more frequent. The United States government created a law that stated that anybody who worked in a factory would not be conscripted into military service because the forces desperately needed all the materials they could get their hands on. Civilians were collecting scrap metal and spare tires to donate to the cause, so at the factories the wheels had to keep on turning. Frank could have quit his job and volunteered to serve in the war, but he didn't, and this drew a great deal of criticism from the townies. Naturally, much of this censure and derision ended in brawls at the bars. On the day of America's victory, the entire town was celebrating, and all personal grudges were temporarily forgotten. Everybody was happy to drink with Frank. As usual, Nanny picked up what was left of him at the end of the night. This time she wasn't angry with him, as she usually was in that scenario. He began to get fresh with her on the way home, putting his hand on her knee. As soon as they got in the house, Frank pushed Nanny against the wall, and they engaged in kissing and heavy petting. After a moment, Nancy had flashbacks to her other dalliances with drunk men, putting their paws all over her body. He wasn't much different in that moment, and she put a stop to it. She took his wrists and pushed his hands away. He was getting rough, and she was worried about what that might lead to. She said, "Get off me." Frank wasn't prepared to take no for an answer. He broke free from her restraint and began to tear at her blouse. She struggled, but this only escalated his arousal. She kicked him in the shins, but he was too inebriated to register the pain. After they wrestled for a minute, he twisted her arm up behind her back until she felt the bones creaking. She cried out from the pain. He said to her, "If you don't listen to me, woman, I ain't going to be here next time." He held her arm in that position as the pain intensified. She finally said, "Fine," to elicit some mercy. It was the first time they had sex in years, and after he took care of his business, he passed out on top of her. That night she could not sleep. The rage that emerged the night when she resolved to kill Robert was overcoming her now. It flooded her capacity for common sense and rational thought and left it waterlogged. She went to the kitchen and took up a large knife. She had tolerated many of his misdeeds over the years because she could not bring herself to accept that there was anything wrong with their relationship. She was a romantic idealist, and to concede that Frank's drinking problem was undermining their relationship was something she couldn't face. Until that evening. She became resolved to murder Frank. The problem was, it wouldn't be as easy as killing children. The option of blaming it on infant mortality was off the table. So how would she get away with killing a grown man? The only thing infantile about Frank was his behavior. He didn't eat his meals at home anymore, so she couldn't poison him. That method just might have enabled her to avoid prosecution, since a pathologist could have diagnosed him as a victim of alcohol poisoning. Since the entire town knew he was a lush, it wouldn't have shocked anyone. The next day, her killer instincts still awaited a provocative action on Frank's part. All it would take was a word to draw her hand as executioner straight at his heart. They held aloof toward each other. Frank had no idea how lucky he was to be alive that day. Nanny was passionate about gardening. She discovered this day that Frank had dug up a spot and unearthed an old bottle of hillbilly moonshine. This was something that could be poisoned, and poisoned it she did. She poured out a couple fingers of moonshine and added some rat poison. She poured some water in to bring the liquid back to its previous level. She shook it up. She was so deliriously happy about Frank's impending demise, she sang and waltzed around the garden by herself. Having finished this, she returned the bottle to where she found it. That night she slept like a baby. She awaited the conclusion of her slumber like a child on Christmas morning. It was a successful kill. In the morning, she found Frank's body in the garden. The pathologist assumed that alcohol poisoning or cirrhosis of the liver was responsible for his untimely departure. There were no signs of foul play. Perfect. The doctor did opine that there could have been something in the moonshine that might have done Frank in, but the fact that the bottle was drained of every available droplet made analysis difficult. Besides, any fool knew that you don't just chug an entire bottle of backwoods, rot-gut moonshine. It's suicidal without the presence of arsenic. Frank's body was not examined post-mortem, and he was buried. Problem had, problem solved. Nannie's daughters kept their distance from Nannie after this incident. In fact, they never spoke to or met with her again for the rest of their lives. Nannie was happy. Not only had she gotten rid of her alcoholic husband, but since he paid into life insurance and there were no signs of foul play in the aftermath of his death, Nannie became the recipient of a hefty sum of cash. There was so much she was able to invest in real estate. She bought 10 acres in a rural district located just on the outskirts of Jacksonville, Alabama. She had a small cottage built so she could live there. She hired farm workers to grow crops, and, combined with some pensions she was receiving, she was financially independent for the first time in her life. She had eclipsed James Hazel commercially and would under no circumstances find herself controlled by him or any other man. It was a lonely place for her. Due to the rumors that she was a murderer, her friendships and familial relationships dried up. Her sisters were skeptical that she could be capable of such a thing, but Lou had observed her behavior throughout the years. She saw it as existing within the realm of possibility. Nannie didn't see many people during this phase of her life, but she still planned on finding the love of her life, that perfect romance that had evaded her thus far, but that she believed was out there waiting for her. She was prepared to search for years. Nannie began scanning ads in the Lonely Hearts columns. Aware of her reputation in the surrounding area, she subscribed to newspapers from more distant locales. She even received papers from other states. She placed an ad in these publications, and she received many replies. At one point, her mailman was burdened with the extra weight of all the mail Nannie received. Nannie's screening process was more thorough this time. She would spend more time getting to know her suitors. She asked pointed questions to weed out the ones who were likely to give her the kind of problems her exes had. Nannie was no longer just content to limit this operation to reading letters. She traveled the country extensively, visiting several cities and meeting with some of her more appealing prospects in their neck of the woods. She met a man named Arlie Lanning in Lexington, North Carolina. Arlie was bowled over by Nannie's appearance, and their relations were harmonious. Nannie was domineering, and Arlie accepted it. By the end of Nannie's visit, they were both smitten. After she returned to Alabama, they got engaged. Nannie packed her things and headed to Lexington, looking forward to her new life as Nannie Lanning. Her side of the aisle was entirely empty. It was puzzling to her in-laws, who were very taken with her. They knew nothing about her dark past back home. How could such a kindly and charming woman have no guests, not even a single bridesmaid? It was a happy marriage during the honeymoon phase. They went out on the town frequently and enjoyed domestic bliss when she served him dinner after he returned from work. It wasn't problem-free, however. She suspected that he was unfaithful to her. Nannie befriended some local women, and they reported what they observed about Arlie's public interactions with females. He was popular with women before he met Nannie, and his appeal did not diminish after they were wedded. When they went out drinking with friends, he often ended up bedding a woman along the way. He lied to Nannie about his activities on these nights. Most of the time, he got away with this due to the lack of evidence. Then he got careless. One night he fell asleep at the home of a woman with whom he had sexual relations. He slept through dinner, in fact. When he returned home, he found that Nanny was not there. He searched the town to see if he could track her down in her favorite haunts. No dice. When he went back home, he found a note she had left him. All she wrote was, "Going on a trip. Be back soon." Nanny returned from her outing a week later. Arlie assumed she went back to Alabama to check on her house and all affairs related to her property and assets. He assumed incorrectly. The train arrived from up north. She went to New York for a little retail therapy. Arlie was contrite, telling her he was mortified by his behavior. He apologized and promised to put a stop to his drinking. He kept that promise and put in more hours at work. Alcohol withdrawal made the experience very trying for him, but he was determined to keep his marriage intact. Nanny carried on as if it had never happened. She became the perfect wife for him again. As long as he was loyal, she would dote on him. Eventually, Arlie's friends convinced him to join them for drinks. He swore he would only have one or two, but it was a slippery slope, and soon he became the drunkard he was during the spell of womanizing that nearly destroyed his marriage. The morning after one of his drinking binges had him standing in his house reading a note left by Nanny. It said, simply, "Back soon." This time she didn't return for a month. As before, she drowned her sorrows on the items she bought when she went shopping. Arlie was embarrassed by his behavior once again. He apologized profusely and even went as far as to dissociate from the men who nudged him back into drinking. Nanny didn't get upset, but she did make it clear that she wouldn't tolerate any more of his bullshit. He didn't know if she pursued revenge for his infidelities between the sheets of a hotel bed or not. If it did cross his mind, he knew he couldn't raise the issue because she could throw his adulterous behavior right back in his face. That argument was already settled. Their marriage continued along this trajectory for 5 years. Nanny kept her darker feelings at bay during this period, but they couldn't be repressed forever. When you transgress against somebody the same way over and over and over again, your apologies are consistently devalued to the point where they lose their worth as currency. Nancy reached the end of her rope starting in winter of 1951. Ironically, Arlie had just dried out. He didn't slip out at night to meet up with friends in bars. It was partly motivated by an influenza epidemic, but he was also serious about being a better husband. As a reward, Nanny spent a month preparing his favorite meals and baked goods. She also satisfied his appetites in the bedroom. Something changed within Nanny as the Christmas season began. She neglected the housework, and the house ran to squalor. She served leftovers as meals, then sandwiches, and eventually stopped cooking altogether. Even her appearance indicated a lack of motivation to maintain the upkeep. She was disheveled with forsaken hygiene. Her dark moods returned. The depression, the anger. This was hard on Arlie, though she apologized one day. She offered to make it up to him by baking one of his favorite pies. It was filled with stewed and sweetened prunes. There was an added ingredient he didn't recognize that left a bitter aftertaste behind in its wake. The next morning, something wasn't right with Arlie. Nanny called a doctor, and he examined him. Arlie was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was logged as heart failure. The doctor assumed that he died from influenza. Many other people in town were dying from the virus, so there was no reason for the doctor to presume that any other factor could be responsible. As in Alabama, Nanny devoured the attention and sympathy that was extended to her as an accompaniment to her gold-plated widow status. Even Arlie's family were kind and generous, offering anything they could to support her. Once Arlie was 6 feet under and all the hubbub petered out, Nanny packed her bags and moved back to her cottage in Alabama after setting fire to the house in Lexington and collecting insurance money since nobody could prove that arson was the cause. There she perused the Lonely Hearts columns in search of suitable prey. This process was interrupted when she was notified by her family that her sister Dovie was critically ill. Since Nanny was not employed and financially secure, she was the only one who had the time and the wherewithal to move in as Dovie's caregiver. Dovie was so weakened by her condition that she could not get out of bed and was robbed of independence. Nanny realized days after she arrived that there was no way Dovie's condition would ever improve. Nanny didn't enjoy being Dovie's nurse, so she decided she would put both of them out of their misery. Nanny served stewed prunes to alleviate Dovie's constipation. The funeral was soon to follow. Nanny was informed that James had died. For years, she plotted her revenge against him. Now that was another dream that, like her vision of a perfect romance, was unlikely to manifest. Adding to her frustration and regret was a very lonely life that had become stale due to the absence of change that is endemic to a hermetic existence. She realized the only place where she was wanted and needed was the farm. She packed her bags. Lou would soon depend on her because the farm still had not broken even, and James kept it afloat with debts he could not pay. The bank was soon to foreclose, and Lou was on the verge of homelessness. Without James in the picture, her children were the only people who could help her. Nanny, as she knew, was a homeowner and had money to spare. Nanny stayed at the farm until all the business was settled. Nobody else in the family was willing to take Lou in, so Nanny agreed to let her live at the cottage. She wasn't exactly thrilled by this. They hadn't been in touch for some time, and there were issues lurking from the past. Another thing that nettled Nanny was that if she didn't take her mother in, everybody in town would criticize her as heartless and cruel. It was bad enough that she was assumed to be a murderer. Nanny hated Lou's cowardice. She acquiesced to James when she should have stood up to him for the benefit of her children. Nanny always wondered if they might have actually been in cahoots. She remembered that very well, and she held a grudge. She was still submissive, and instead of enjoying the power she had over Lou, that characteristic only made her angrier. Her victimhood made a victim of Nanny when she was a child. Now Lou's victimhood made of her a parasite, and Nanny was expected to play the host. Lou was shitting on Nanny's dream of meeting the heroic man of her dreams and having the perfect marriage. No man would want to move in and assume partial responsibility for the care of an elderly woman. Nanny didn't even want to do it. Nevertheless, Nanny bowed to societal pressure and took care of her mother all the way to her last days when she was bedridden. As usual, Nanny was the recipient of sympathy and support from the community. The drawback to Lou's death, from Nanny's point of view, was that she was at that point completely estranged from her family. There was a silver lining, however. Nanny was now at liberty to write a new draft of the story of her life. Nanny sought new hunting ground for a new male companion. She was a middle-aged woman. She had lost, with the passing years, her trim figure and other hallmarks of youth. Young men were no longer interested. She had to lay her hooks into a mature gentleman. Hence, she joined an organization called the Diamond Circle Club. It was essentially a matchmaking service for mature people. For a fee, its members were added to a list of suitors and to the general membership directory. Some personal details were included. Nanny joined in 1953. She was inundated with replies from across the country. Because of the advanced age of the respondents, it was rare to encounter a man whose primary interest was casual encounters. These men were looking for wives. They were divorcees and widowers, and they needed someone who would take care of them. However, Nanny was still looking for a gentleman who believed in romance like she did. A retired salesman in his 60s, Kansas resident Richard Morton fit the bill. He wasn't much of a poet, and he didn't have movie star good looks, but his relationship goals were similar. Nanny traveled to Kansas to meet him. She was pleasantly surprised. He was better looking than he appeared in the photograph she had seen. She was very taken with him. During her stay, they exchanged many kisses. Before she returned home, Richard proposed marriage. She agreed and moved into his house. Richard sent a letter to the Diamond Circle Club requesting that his and Nanny's names be excised. Nanny enjoyed her new life. She had never been to Big Sky country before she met Robert, and she was perpetually awestruck by the vista she beheld. Richard didn't spend his nights at bars and in other women's bedrooms. Suspicion began to creep in like a pestilence. Richard often drove into town to get supplies. He would leave in the morning and not return until late in the afternoon. When she asked him what kept him so long, he would say he dawdled. He would usually make up for it with gifts. He retired at a very high level of financial security. Among the gifts he bought for her were jewelry and fur coats. Richard found it easier to express his love with material items than with words and physical gestures. Eventually, the excitement of receiving the gifts faded. What remained was the question that refused to die. What was he doing during all that time spent dawdling? She didn't have a network of spies because they lived in a very isolated location, and she hadn't made any friends in town. Usually during her excursions into town, she was accompanied by Richard. Her only source of gossip was the rumor mill at the local beauty parlor. There she learned that Richard's eligibility as a bachelor was commonly known. Most of the women who expressed their interest were attracted to his money. In fact, he still bought gifts for other women. He would even buy them presents that were identical to what he bought for Nanny. She handled it stoically in the salon. She didn't get upset and didn't make a scene. When Richard returned home, Nanny greeted him with a knowing smile. Richard had no intentions of being faithful to Nanny. Of course, while lying to her about his fidelity, she came factory installed with dark secrets of her own. Following this letdown, Nanny started corresponding with gentlemen suitors. She told them she was recently widowed and living in Kansas. She was open to travel and adventure after her marriage had expired. Meanwhile, she took out life insurance policies on Robert. Speaking of financial documents, she learned that Robert went deeply into debt, purchasing all the extravagant gifts he showered on Nanny and his other women. He would never be able to pay his way out of the red. He had overspent to the point where his personal worth would not cover the bill. Nanny had had it with Robert, another charlatan who made false promises. This she was not prepared to abide. She presented a pie to him that she said was her mother's apple pie recipe. The truth was, it was filled with stewed prunes and rat poison. It was an uneventful demise. Robert went to sleep and never woke. After settling business related to insurance and other financial matters, she moved out of the house. Nanny began meeting men through correspondence again. She didn't rejoin the Diamond Circle Club because she felt their screening process was not thorough enough. She would travel to meet some of the men, but only after they were carefully examined. She wanted to cut down on the mistakes she was making. Nanny discovered what women her age come to realize, to their dismay. The men who haven't been scooped up are the type that would hold limited to no appeal for almost any women. Still, she retained her optimism and didn't give up. She journeyed to Oklahoma to meet a man named Samuel Doss. She was impressed with his appearance, considering that he was 59 years old. He was a state highway inspector during the week and a preacher on Sundays. He was straight edge, going so far as to eschew casual sex. He didn't even swear. This was just fine by Nanny. It was the vices of her deceased husbands that got the better of them and sabotaged the marriages. Only a month after putting Richard 6 feet under, Nanny married Samuel Doss. She moved into his house in Tulsa. Samuel was very different from her other husbands. He was not an alpha male roughneck type. He would assist her with domestic duties. He was never verbally or physically abusive. There was one aspect of his character Nanny could have done without. He was miserly. They couldn't run an electric fan in the summer unless the heat was unbearable. Lights had to be switched off when leaving a room. He also rejected spontaneity wholesale. Everything was tightly scheduled. Even sex was penciled in according to time and date, and was apportioned a finite amount of time. Luxuries or simple treats were a thing of the past. After her shopping trips in New York and eating at the finest restaurants in town, Samuel's immoderately ascetic lifestyle was too much for her to bear. It was as if he viewed happiness itself as a sin, and this wasn't far off the mark. 3 months of this was more than she could stand, and she moved back to her cottage in Alabama, where she would be free to indulge her comparably God-sized appetites. She may have been alone there, but at least she could enjoy life on her terms. Samuel was too much like James Hazel. When she arrived home, a letter from Samuel was waiting for her. He neither apologized nor promised to change. He systematically laid out his reasons for why she should not leave him. Vintage Samuel. He insisted that if she lived with him long enough, she would enjoy the same routine predictability. This only exacerbated her anger. When James Hazel died, it left Nanny unable to resolve their differences and get even. Samuel Doss, on the other hand, was still alive. He was the perfect stand-in for James. Ascetic, miserly, humorless, exacting, and unforgiving. Killing Samuel would be like killing James in effigy. All she needed was for Samuel to do something so offensive that, by drawing Nanny's killer instincts to the surface, he was practically committing suicide with her hand. She informed Samuel that she would return to his home. In the meantime, she responded to some of the letters she received from other suitors. Samuel was ecstatic about Nanny's return, even if he was too stoic and repressed to be completely demonstrative. Nanny tried to initiate a sexual encounter the evening of her return, but it wasn't scheduled, so Samuel wasn't having it. Nanny informed him that one condition of her return was that they share everything as married couples do, which included his bank accounts. Not only did he add her name to what became joint accounts, but he made her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. It was as if he had signed his death warrant in triplicate. Relations between the couple soured soon after. Nanny removed Samuel's leather-bound books in the living room and replaced them with her favorite dog-eared romance paperbacks. He didn't want those books in his house, feeling they were sinful. She pointed out to him that he read every night, but he snapped his fingers to stop the conversation. He contended that he read for intellectual and spiritual enrichment. He said her books, on the other hand, were the lowest form of trash on the market. He informed her that her reservation in hell was confirmed if she continued to read such filth. He refused to buy her a television for that same reason. I Love Lucy was akin to hardcore pornography as far as Samuel Doss was concerned. He wouldn't hear her objections any longer. God had spoken, and his was the final word. These arguments didn't sway Nanny. She was a murderess with an insatiable craving for the pleasures of the flesh. There was nothing pious about her. She grew silent. She would respond to him with actions, not words, and Samuel would be silenced eternally. Samuel had finally committed the unforgivable transgression. He threw Nanny's romance novels in the garbage. Without those books, she was miserable. They provided her with the only diversion she had from the cultural mausoleum Samuel made of both their lives. Poison was always her execution method of choice, but Samuel didn't have a sweet tooth. He did drink coffee, so she added arsenic to the brew. It took a while, but gradually the poison ate away at his insides, and his health deteriorated. His appetite and strength were the first to go. He lost 15 pounds and was so weak he rarely got out of bed for a week. Throughout that period, he was seized with spasms and stomach cramps. His doctor was puzzled by it, struggling to find the kernel of it all. Samuel was taken to hospital to receive continuous care. He was treated by one Dr. Schwelbein, and his diagnosis was a massive infection of the intestinal tract. Penicillin was administered. Despite the staff's best efforts, Samuel did not recover completely. Nanny played the role of supportive wife. Nobody assumed hers were crocodile tears, and everybody admired her as she doted on her ailing husband. 23 days after the onset of his illness, Samuel returned home. He was in good spirits, even if he was still fairly weakened by his condition. He was grateful for how she cared for him during his convalescence. He even spoke of loosening up a little, allowing for more spontaneity and fun in their daily routines. She prepared a lavish meal for him, complete with a cup of coffee, blended exactly as he liked it. As he dined, she dreamed of finding romance again among the living. Next morning, the ambulance arrived. Nanny gave an Oscar-worthy performance, weeping over the condition of her husband. His gastric infection hadn't been completely cured, and there was always a possibility that it could recur. This time he was put out of his misery. He was pronounced dead and shipped off to the hospital morgue. Everybody in town expressed their sympathies toward Nanny. After collecting on this and all the money she inherited following the hour of Samuel Doss's demise, she hopped the next train to Alabama. She looked forward to poring over her letters from her many suitors. She was still optimistic that she would find the romance of her dreams. Dr. Schwelbein was a gastroenterologist who specialized in infections of the intestinal tract. He was surprised when Samuel's infection resisted the antibiotics he administered. When Dr. Schwelbein found Doss's body in the morgue, he had a feeling something wasn't right. He did not have the legal authority to conduct an autopsy, regardless of his suspicions about the cause of death. The official report had already been filed. Still, his suspicions got the better of him, so he decided to approach the only person who might know the truth for sure, Nanny Doss. He contacted her as the only next of kin available and asked her for her consent to conduct an autopsy. He approached her when the house was full of mourners. He confronted her in front of them, talking about the curious nature of her husband's death. He said that his illness was unlikely to happen without the injection of some kind of environmental contaminant through his work. He said it was something that could cause a public health crisis if it weren't handled properly. She was unable to talk her way out of it with so many prying eyes around, so she gave her permission and signed the permission slip. To do otherwise would have aroused suspicion from everybody. During Dr. Schwelbein's autopsy, he examined the contents of Samuel Doss's stomach. His findings: semi-digested pork roast with trimmings, remnants of coffee, enough cyanide to kill a horse. Only one person could have served this holy man his last supper. The police brought Nanny in for questioning. She denied culpability, but they found her tone to be odd. Slightly restrained, but hysterical, bouts of laughter kept bursting out of her. The implication was that the idea that she would kill her husband was so ludicrous that it was laughable. She got herself together later on, but the interrogation yielded no fruit. Special Agent Ray Page stepped in when the other investigators left after hours of exhaustive questioning. Nanny turned on the charm, saying, "Oh, you are a handsome young man, but if you think I hurt anybody, I'm afraid you're as good-looking as you are foolish." Page didn't take the bait. He constructed a timeline of her life. He didn't neglect to mention all the deaths that occurred under mysterious circumstances, with her as the common denominator. He formed two hypotheses about her personality. She was either out of touch with reality or a very effective actress. Either way, he set as his objective the task of breaking through the wall of illusion or delusion. She was distracting herself with a magazine. He ripped it from her hands. He had her attention now. He said, "Do you believe in ghosts, Nanny?" Nanny was dumbfounded. Page continued, "A few years doing my job, you start to believe in them. They don't haunt places, you see. They haunt people. I meet a lot of haunted people doing my job. People that have done wrong and know that they have done wrong." Nanny giggled. "I keep telling you boys, I don't know what you're talking about." "How many husbands have you buried, Nanny? How many of their ghosts are in this room with us right now?" Nanny stonewalled him. The mirth in her eyes, in all its artifice, disappeared into the abyss of her pupils. There was nothing besides. "We can do this the hard way, with me running around the country, gathering up the evidence of all the folks that you killed. If I have to do that, then I'll be pushing for the death penalty. But if you admit to what you've done, then things will go a little easier on you." She was silent for a moment. Then, with a giggle that contributed to her nickname of the Giggling Granny, she said, all right. I put rat poison in his coffee." Page was astonished that it happened with so little effort. Nanny had more to get off her chest. "He was a miser of a man. He wouldn't let me watch my shows on the television. He wouldn't let me run the fan even on the hottest nights. I mean, what woman could live in circumstances like that?" Page encouraged her. "He sounds very cruel, Nanny." After taking a breath, she started giggling again. "There you have it. Now my conscience is clear. Can I have my magazine back now? If you'll tell us about your other husbands, I'll be happy to give it back to you. You promise?" "I promise. Now tell me about Morton." Page questioned her about the murders of her other husbands. She denied harming any of her relatives. Nanny Doss was taken into custody. Law enforcement officials attended to the morbid labors of exhuming the bodies of her victims. The coroners all detected the presence of arsenic. The bodies of her children were left as they were. The police had all the incriminating evidence they needed. Meanwhile, Charlie Bragg, the so-called one who got away, reveled in the attention he got from the media. He even profited from telling his story to anyone who was willing to pay. Nanny herself was interviewed. The journalists got a helping of her infamous giggle. When they asked her what punishment she felt she deserved for killing Samuel Doss, she said, "Whatever they choose to do to me will be on their conscience." She was examined by court-mandated psychiatrists and was found to be sane enough to stand trial. The trial was due to begin on June 2, 1955, in the criminal court of Tulsa. She had already entered a guilty plea on May 17th. June 2nd was the date when she was to receive her sentence. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. She did not receive the electric chair due to the fact that she was a woman. Nanny Doss died of leukemia in the hospital ward of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1965 at the age of 59. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.